She stood at the entrance of the British military hospital, her hands trembling as she clutched her discharge papers, certain of one thing. This building was a trap. The propaganda had been explicit. British hospitals experimented on German prisoners, used them for medical training, showed no mercy to the enemy. But when Rosa Bergmann was forced through those doors after a work accident in a POW camp in Kent in March 1945, what she discovered inside would shatter every belief she'd held about her captors, and the truth would haunt her for the rest of her life. Before we reveal this remarkable story, if you enjoy uncovering these forgotten chapters of World War II history, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. These stories must be preserved. The war in Europe was in its final brutal months on March 18, 1945. But for Rosa Bergmann, a 27-year-old factory supervisor from Cologne, that date marked not the approaching peace, but the beginning of something she couldn't comprehend. She had spent the previous 18 months managing production schedules in a munitions plant in occupied Holland, her hands coordinating workers in a concrete building that smelled of metal and machine oil. Her fiancé, Heinrich, had been killed in the Battle of the Bulge 2 months earlier. She had received the telegram in January. She knew exactly what those words meant, though accepting them was impossible. When the Canadian forces liberated Holland in early March, they rounded up everyone connected to German military production. Rosa was among hundreds of auxiliaries and workers processed and sent to prisoner of war facilities in England. She was healthy, strong, and showed no signs of illness. Just another enemy worker to be detained until the war's end and repatriation could be arranged. The journey across the Channel took 9 hours. The ship was a converted merchant vessel, its holds packed with German prisoners. Rosa shared a cramped space with 53 other women, most of them exhausted, all of them frightened about what awaited them. The smell of diesel and sea spray filled every breath. Many were seasick, the buckets overflowing as the ship pitched and rolled. During those long hours at sea, the women whispered warnings to each other. Stories they'd heard about British detention facilities, British hospitals, British doctors. Some claimed the British used German prisoners for medical experiments, testing new drugs and procedures. Others insisted that injured prisoners were left to die without treatment. A woman named Elsa, who claimed her cousin had been captured the previous year, told the group with absolute certainty, "If you get sick or injured, refuse the hospital. Better to suffer in the camp than go to a British medical facility. You won't come back the same, if you come back at all." Rosa listened and said nothing. She was healthy, strong, careful. She wouldn't get sick. She wouldn't get injured. She would simply survive until she could go home to whatever remained of Cologne and her family. The ship reached Dover on a cold, wet morning in mid-March. The English sky was grey, heavy with rain that fell in steady sheets. Rosa had not seen rain like this since before the bombing of Cologne intensified. Clean rain, without the smell of smoke and ash. The cold that struck as she descended the gangway was penetrating, settling deep in her bones despite her heavy coat. They were loaded into trucks with canvas sides that snapped in the wind. As the convoy moved inland, Rosa peered through gaps in the fabric and stared at a world that seemed impossible. Buildings intact, streets without craters, people going about ordinary lives, shops with goods in windows, children walking to school, everything untouched by the devastation that had consumed Germany. The truck drove for hours through the Kent countryside. Rolling green fields despite the late winter season, farmhouses with smoke rising peacefully from chimneys, orchards waiting for spring. Everything looked preserved, eternal, unmarked by war. Rosa thought of the flattened neighbourhoods of Cologne, the skeletal cathedrals standing amid ruins, the endless refugees. The contrast made her chest ache. Finally, the convoy approached a facility with gates and guard towers. A sign read, "Camp Langley, Kent, Prisoner of War Facility." The gates swung open and the trucks rolled into a compound of Nissan huts and wooden buildings surrounded by wire fencing. This would be home until the war ended and they could return to Germany, however long that took. Processing was efficient and impersonal. Forms filled out, numbers assigned, photographs taken, medical examinations conducted by a British doctor who seemed more bored than hostile. Rosa was declared fit for light labour and assigned to the camp workshop where prisoners repaired military equipment and manufactured small components. The work was tedious, but not difficult. Rosa spent her days at a workbench, assembling small metal parts under the supervision of British soldiers who rarely spoke to the prisoners. The workshop was cold, poorly lit, and filled with the constant noise of machinery. But it was work. It kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. It made the days pass. And for 3 weeks, Rosa's plan worked perfectly. She stayed healthy. She avoided trouble. She kept to herself. She was simply another prisoner waiting for the war to end. Until March 18th, 1945. It was mid-afternoon. Rosa was working at her bench, fitting small components together with practiced precision. The workshop was noisy as always, the sound of machinery drowning out conversation. She reached for a metal part, her attention focused on the delicate assembly work. She didn't see the mechanical press malfunction, didn't hear the warning shout from across the workshop, didn't realize anything was wrong until she felt a crushing impact on her left hand. Pain exploded through her, immediate, overwhelming, all-consuming. She screamed, a sound that cut through even the machinery noise. Blood bloomed across the workbench, shockingly red against the grey metal. Someone hit the emergency stop. The machinery ground to a halt. Hands pulled her away from the press. She looked down at her hand and felt the world tilt. Her fingers were mangled, crushed, bleeding heavily. She could see bone. "Get the medic!" someone shouted in English. "Get the doctor, now!" Rosa heard the words through a haze of pain and shock. Doctor. Hospital. The warnings from the ship flooded back. British hospitals were dangerous. British doctors experimented on prisoners. Better to suffer than to go. "No," she managed to say in broken English. "No doctor, no hospital." But hands were already wrapping her mangled hand in cloth, already guiding her toward the door. A vehicle was being brought. She was being taken whether she wanted to or not. "Please," she begged in German, then tried in English. "Please, no hospital. I stay here. I stay." The British medic who was applying pressure to her hand looked at her with something like pity. "You'll lose the hand if we don't get you to hospital immediately," he said, in careful, accented German. "You're going. That's not a choice." And so, Rosa Bergmann found herself in an ambulance racing toward the very place she'd been warned never to go. A British military hospital, where German prisoners went and didn't come back the same, if they came back at all. The hospital was a sprawling complex of brick buildings with a central tower. As the ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance, Rosa's terror reached a crescendo. She tried to pull away, tried to refuse to exit the vehicle, but the pain was too intense, the blood loss too severe. She was barely conscious as they lifted her onto a gurney and wheeled her through doors that seemed to swallow her whole. The last thing she remembered before darkness took her was the smell. Disinfectant and ether, and something else she couldn't identify. The smell of a place she'd been told she should fear above all else. When Rosa regained consciousness, she was lying in a bed in a white room. Her left hand was heavily bandaged, elevated on a pillow. An IV line ran into her right arm. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back. The accident, the ambulance, the hospital, the British hospital. She was in the place she'd been warned about. The place where German prisoners were experimented on, where they didn't come back the same. She tried to sit up and immediately felt gentle hands pressing her shoulders back down. "Easy now," a voice said in English. "You've just come out of surgery. Don't try to move yet." Rosa's eyes focused on the speaker. A British nurse, young, perhaps in her late 20s, wearing a crisp white uniform with a red cross on the arm. Her expression was professional, but not unkind. My hand, Rosa whispered in German. The nurse seemed to understand. She switched to halting, accented German. Your hand was badly crushed, she said carefully. The surgeon worked on it for 3 hours. He saved your fingers. All of them. You'll need time to heal, but you should regain most of the function. Rosa stared at her, unable to process the words. Saved her fingers? 3 hours of surgery? This didn't match what she'd been told. This didn't match the stories at all. I don't understand, she said. The nurse pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. What don't you understand? She asked gently. Why? Rosa managed. Why did the surgeon... I'm a prisoner. I'm German. Why would you spend 3 hours saving my hand? The nurse looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. Understanding, perhaps, or maybe sadness. Because that's what we do, she said simply. We're medical professionals. We treat people who need treatment. The war doesn't change that. But the stories, Rosa whispered. The warnings. They said British hospitals. What did they say? The nurse asked. Rosa hesitated, then spoke. That you experiment on German prisoners. That you use us for medical training. That we don't come back the same. The nurse was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and left the room without a word. Rosa lay there in growing terror. She had said too much, revealed too much. They would punish her now for knowing their secrets, for speaking the accusations aloud. But when the door opened again, it wasn't just the nurse who entered. A man in a white coat came with her. Older, perhaps 60, with grey hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. The surgeon, Rosa realised, the one who had operated on her hand. He pulled up the other chair and sat beside her bed. Mrs. Bergmann, he said in perfect German. I understand you've been told some disturbing things about British military hospitals, about what we do to German prisoners who require medical care. Rosa nodded, unable to speak. I want to show you something, he said. He stood and gestured for her to look out the window beside her bed. Rosa turned her head and saw the ward beyond. Beds lined up in rows. And in those beds, she saw German prisoners. Men and women in hospital gowns, some with bandages, some with casts, some reading, some sleeping. British nurses moving between the beds, checking on patients, adjusting pillows, bringing water. This is Ward C, the surgeon explained. It's designated for POW patients who require extended care. As you can see, they're receiving the same medical treatment as British soldiers in the wards upstairs. The same care, the same respect, the same professional standards. He sat back down and looked directly at Rosa. We don't experiment on prisoners, Mrs. Bergmann. We treat them, according to their medical needs, according to our Hippocratic oath, according to international law, and according to basic human decency. But why did they tell us? Rosa began. Propaganda, the nurse said quietly. Fear. Control. If German soldiers and workers are terrified of British medical facilities, they'll hide injuries. They'll avoid seeking help. They'll refuse treatment even when it's desperately needed. It's a form of psychological warfare, and it's very effective. The surgeon nodded. Your hand was catastrophically injured, Mrs. Bergmann. If you had delayed treatment even an hour longer, we would have had to amputate. As it was, I spent 3 hours reconstructing the bones, repairing the tendons, saving what could be saved. Not because you're German or British, but because you're a human being who deserved the best medical care I could provide. Rosa felt tears streaming down her face. Everything she'd believed, everything she'd been told, was a lie. Not a partial lie, not an exaggeration, a complete, deliberate fabrication. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry I believed them. I'm sorry I tried to refuse treatment. I'm sorry. You have nothing to apologize for, the surgeon said firmly. You were told lies by people you trusted. You acted accordingly. The fault isn't yours. He stood and checked her chart, making notes with practiced efficiency. You'll be with us for at least 2 weeks, he said. The hand needs to heal before we can remove the external fixation. You'll need physical therapy after that. But Mrs. Bergmann, I want you to understand something very clearly. You're going to recover. You're going to keep your hand. You're going to regain function, because that's what good medicine does. For the next 2 weeks, Rosa remained in the hospital, and every day her understanding of the world shifted and reformed. She watched British nurses care for German patients with the same attention they gave British soldiers. She saw doctors make rounds, consulting charts, adjusting treatments, explaining procedures in careful German to patients who didn't speak English. She observed physical therapists working patiently with injured prisoners, helping them regain mobility and strength. She saw no experiments, no cruelty, no neglect. Just professional medical care delivered with competence and often with genuine kindness. Her own recovery progressed well. The surgeon, his name was Dr. Morrison, she learned, checked on her daily. The external fixation holding her shattered bones in place was uncomfortable but effective. The pain gradually decreased. The swelling reduced. The risk of infection was carefully managed. And the nurse, who had first spoken to her, whose name was Elizabeth, visited every day. Sometimes for medical reasons, sometimes just to talk. "How long have you worked here?" Rosa asked one afternoon. 3 years, Elizabeth replied. "Since 1942. I've treated hundreds of German prisoners in that time. Injuries from work accidents like yours, illnesses, complications from pre-existing conditions, even a few women who gave birth while in custody." "And you've never—" Rosa hesitated. "Never what? Never treated us differently, never withheld care, never compromised our medical ethics," Elizabeth finished. "No, never. That's not who we are." She sat down in the chair beside Rosa's bed, a position she'd taken many times over the past week. "I want you to understand something, Mrs. Bergmann. The people who told you British hospitals were dangerous weren't describing reality. They were describing their own fears, their own propaganda, their own projections of what they themselves might do in our position." "What do you mean?" Rosa asked. Elizabeth chose her words carefully. "If German hospitals treated British prisoners the way you were told British hospitals treat Germans, well, then it makes sense to assume we would do the same to you. But we don't, because we believe in medical ethics, in international law, in the idea that a patient is a patient, regardless of which uniform they wore." Rosa thought about this, about the assumptions she'd made, about the propaganda she'd believed without question. "I've been such a fool," she said quietly. "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "You were lied to. That's not the same thing." On her 10th day in the hospital, Rosa witnessed something that would stay with her forever. A German prisoner was brought into the ward. A young man, perhaps 20, with severe burns on his arms and chest from a factory accident. He was screaming in pain and terror, begging in German not to be tortured, not to be used for experiments. Rosa watched as Dr. Morrison and 2 nurses approached him calmly, speaking in soothing German, explaining exactly what they were going to do. The young man fought them, convinced they were lying, convinced this was a trap. And then Dr. Morrison did something unexpected. He called over a German prisoner who had been in the ward for several weeks, recovering from a broken leg. He asked the man to speak to the new patient, to explain what actually happened in this hospital. Rosa watched as the older German prisoner sat beside the terrified young man and spoke quietly, urgently, explaining that the doctors were telling the truth, that they really would treat his burns, that he really would receive proper pain medication, that everything they'd been told about British hospitals was a lie. Gradually, the young man's terror subsided. He allowed the nurses to start an IV. He consented to the treatment. And Rosa watched as Dr. Morrison personally cleaned and dressed those terrible burns with a gentleness that seemed impossible for an enemy doctor treating an enemy patient. Later that evening, Elizabeth found Rosa sitting in the day room, staring out the window at the darkening sky. "You saw what happened with the burn patient," Elizabeth said. It wasn't a question. Rosa nodded. "He believed the same lies I did. He was just as terrified." "Most of them are," Elizabeth said. "We see it constantly. Patients who refuse treatment, who hide injuries, who resist care because they've been told we're monsters. And every time, we have to prove we're not. We have to earn trust that should be automatic for medical professionals." "How do you do it?" Rosa asked. "How do you stay patient? How do you not get angry with us for believing such terrible things about you?" Elizabeth sat down beside her. "Because I understand propaganda. I understand fear. I understand that if I'd been told the same lies, been subjected to the same indoctrination, I might believe them too. My anger isn't with the prisoners who believe the lies. It's with the system that tells them in the first place." She was quiet for a moment, then continued. "You know what's most tragic? Some prisoners still don't believe us, even after they've been treated, even after they've received excellent care and been discharged healthy. They convince themselves there must be some hidden agenda, some long-term experiment, because accepting the truth means accepting that they were lied to. And that's harder for some people than continuing to believe the lie." Rosa thought about this. "I won't be one of them," she said quietly. "I won't go back and pretend this didn't happen. I won't deny what I've seen." "That takes courage," Elizabeth said, "more than you might think." After 2 weeks, Rosa's hand had healed enough for the external fixation to be removed. The surgery to remove the pins and plates was brief, conducted under local anesthesia so Rosa could watch if she chose. She did watch. She watched Dr. Morrison work with practiced precision, explaining each step, ensuring she felt no pain, treating her damaged hand with the same care he would give any patient. When the procedure was complete, he wrapped her hand in a lighter bandage and gave her instructions for physical therapy. "You'll regain about 80% function," he told her in his careful German. "Maybe more with dedicated therapy. You'll have some stiffness, some reduced grip strength, but you'll have your hand, Mrs. Bergmann. You'll be able to write, to work, to live a normal life." "Thank you," Rosa said, and the words felt inadequate for what he'd done. Dr. Morrison smiled. "You're welcome. Now, you'll be returning to the camp tomorrow, but you'll come back here 3 times a week for physical therapy. Elizabeth will arrange the transport." Rosa returned to Camp Langley the next day. When she walked back into the workshop, the other prisoners stared at her with a mixture of relief and disbelief. One of them, a woman named Greta who worked at the next bench, approached her cautiously. "You're back," Greta said. You're all right?" "Yes," Rosa said. "I'm all right." "But you were in the British hospital for 2 weeks. We thought—" "You thought what they told us," Rosa finished. "That I wouldn't come back the same. That I'd be experimented on. That something terrible would happen." Greta nodded, fear and curiosity warring in her expression. Rosa held up her bandaged hand. "A British surgeon spent 3 hours reconstructing this, saved every finger, gave me back the use of my hand. British nurses cared for me around the clock. I received pain medication, antibiotics, the same treatment any British soldier would receive." The other women gathered around now, listening intently. "Everything we were told about British hospitals is a lie," Rosa said clearly. "Not an exaggeration, not a partial truth, a deliberate, complete lie. They don't experiment on us, they don't mistreat us, they treat us like patients, like human beings." "How can you be sure?" someone asked. "How do you know they're not just waiting, that there's not some long-term effect?" Rosa understood the question, understood the resistance to accepting the truth. "I watched them treat other German prisoners," she said. "I saw a young man with terrible burns receive immediate, expert care. I saw doctors and nurses working to save us, not harm us. And I saw German prisoners who had been there for weeks, recovering, healing, being prepared to return to the camps healthy. She paused, then continued. The lies served a purpose. They made us afraid. They made us hide injuries. They made us refuse help even when we desperately needed it. And that benefits no one except the people who want us to suffer unnecessarily. Over the following weeks, Rosa made 6 trips back to the hospital for physical therapy. Each time, she observed more, learned more, saw more evidence that everything she'd been told was false. She saw a British nurse spend an hour with a German prisoner who was having a panic attack, speaking softly in broken German, helping her breathe, offering comfort. She saw Dr. Morrison argue with a military officer who wanted to discharge a German patient early, insisting the man needed 2 more days of observation, regardless of his prisoner status. She saw Elizabeth on her day off, visiting a German patient who had no family, bringing flowers and books in German. She saw humanity, not propaganda, not ideology, just people choosing to be decent to other people, even when those people were technically enemies. And with each visit, Rosa's understanding of the world shifted. Everything was more complicated than the propaganda suggested. Good and evil weren't neatly divided by national borders. People were capable of both tremendous cruelty and tremendous kindness, sometimes within the same system. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The celebration in the camp was muted. The German prisoners knew what waited for them at home: devastation, hunger, a country divided and occupied. The end of the war was not liberation for them, but just the beginning of a new kind of uncertainty. Rosa's final physical therapy session was in early June. Elizabeth met her at the hospital entrance, as she had so many times before. "This is your last session," Elizabeth said as they walked to the therapy room. "How does the hand feel?" Rosa flexed her fingers, demonstrating the range of motion she'd regained. "Good. Not perfect, but good. Dr. Morrison was right. About 80% function. I can write, I can work, I can live normally." "I'm glad," Elizabeth said, and she meant it. After the therapy session, Elizabeth walked Rosa back to the entrance where the camp transport was waiting. They stood together in the spring sunshine, and Rosa found herself struggling with words she needed to say. "I want to thank you," she finally managed, "not just for the medical care, for showing me the truth, for being patient with my fear, for treating me like a human being when I'd been convinced you were monsters." Elizabeth smiled sadly. "I wish more people could learn that lesson without needing to be injured first." "When I go home," Rosa said, "when I return to Germany, I'm going to tell people about this, about what really happened in British hospitals, about the lies we were told and the truth I discovered." "Some people won't believe you," Elizabeth warned. "They'll say you were brainwashed, or you're lying, or you're naive." "I know," Rosa said, "but I'll tell them anyway, because the truth matters. Because lies like the ones we were told make the world worse, and because people like you and Dr. Morrison deserve to have the truth told about what you did." They shook hands, carefully because of Rosa's still healing injury, and then Rosa climbed into the transport for the last time. Rosa Bergmann was repatriated to Germany in August 1945. She returned to Cologne to find it almost completely destroyed. Her family's home was gone. Her parents were living with relatives in a single room. Her younger brother had been killed in the final weeks of the war. The Germany she returned to was a place of devastation and despair. Food was scarce. Housing was nearly impossible to find. The future looked impossibly bleak. But Rosa carried something with her that many others didn't. She carried the truth. The complicated, uncomfortable truth that the enemy had shown her kindness when they could have shown cruelty. That British medical professionals had treated her with competence and compassion. That the propaganda had been lies designed to make her suffer unnecessarily. She wrote letters to Dr. Morrison and Elizabeth, though she didn't know if they would reach them. She thanked them again for saving her hand and for showing her that the world was more complex than propaganda suggested. She told them about Cologne, about her family, about the challenges of rebuilding. Months later, she received a response. Elizabeth had written back, a brief letter expressing gladness that Rosa and her family had survived, offering encouragement for the difficult work of rebuilding and including a small care package of medical supplies that were desperately needed in post-war Germany. The letter ended with words Rosa would never forget. "You were right to tell people the truth, even when they don't want to hear it. That's how we prevent the next war, not through more propaganda, but through more truth. Take care of that hand, and take care of yourself." Rosa kept that letter for the rest of her life. She kept the medical records from her treatment, she kept photographs Elizabeth had sent of the hospital staff, and she told her story. To her family, to neighbours, to anyone who would listen. Some people didn't believe her. They couldn't accept that British doctors had treated German prisoners with such care. It didn't fit their understanding of the war, of the enemy, of how the world worked. But others listened, and learned, and began to question the other propaganda they'd been fed. And that, Rosa believed, mattered. When Rosa died in 2002 at the age of 84, her family found a box of documents she'd carefully preserved. Medical records from a British military hospital, letters from British medical staff, photographs of Ward C with its rows of beds filled with German prisoners receiving care, and a handwritten note in Rosa's careful script. "They told me British hospitals were dangerous. They told me I would be experimented on, tortured, left to die. Every word was a lie. The truth was far more powerful than I could have imagined. The truth was that even in war, even between enemies, some people choose to honour their oaths, to respect human dignity, to treat a mangled hand with the same care they would give their own countrymen. That truth saved my life, and it changed how I understood everything. Never believe propaganda without questioning it. Never accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truth is available. And never forget that people are capable of choosing kindness, even when the world gives them every excuse to choose cruelty." That is the story of Rosa Bergmann. A story of lies believed and truth discovered. Of propaganda that nearly cost her hand and medical care that saved it. Of British doctors and nurses who treated an enemy prisoner with the same professional dedication they gave their own soldiers. A story that reminds us that the truth, however uncomfortable, is always more valuable than the most comforting lie. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the power of propaganda and the importance of questioning what we're told, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories from World War II remind us that truth is always more complex than propaganda, and that human decency can survive even the worst conflicts.